Welcome to Norse Code, the number one podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host producer. My name is James Pagashnik. Thank you guys so much for listening. And at the other end of the tin cannon string, we have our analyst and co-host. You know him from numerous blogs and podcasts around the internet. He is Mr. Useful Human, Arif Hassan. Arif, how are you enjoying the UK, and can you make it something that I would never want to visit ever in my life?
I'm loving Germany, man. It's so great. The people here are so fantastic. Schnitzel hits different here, I think, for some reason. I can't really explain it.
Are you weirded out the fact that everyone speaks English in this country that you're in?
I don't get it, man. That's so weird. And with a British accent too, which I guess they're like closer to England than the United States. But you'd think it'd be like a German accent, right? But no, I haven't heard. I've heard one person speak German here. It's crazy. Also, the street signs are in English. Kind of an unusual scenario. I don't really know what happened.
Is it a bit like those World War II movies where all the bad guys are speaking English and like in British accents?
Yeah, no, yeah. It's the image of a World War II movie. I don't really. It's so bizarre. Also, everything is in pounds. I don't know what that's about either.
Well, welcome to this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys are all doing well. We have a game to preview. We'll be previewing the Jets game here in just a moment, and we have a mailbag as well. But before we start, again, thank you guys so much for listening to Norse Code. If you enjoy the show and would like to help us out financially, you can do so in a couple of different ways. You can head over to patreon.com/NorseCode for $3.50 a month or a little less for the year subscription. You get access to the Discord, the new bonus episode, which we've gotten rave reviews over, that Arif does not remember recording at all. That is going to be that is available right now. It's actually
send that to me?
I can. It is very good. It does include a story about a child that was playing with a toy that was inappropriate at a soccer game that I had attended.
Okay. I actually remember this. Hey, well, you said it, not me, so maybe that's why I remember it.
that actually explains a lot. But check that out. That's over on Patreon. Special thank you to Maddox, who subscribed to us over on Patreon. Thank you so much. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode as well for a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com for any number of wonderful Norse Code items of merch, including t-shirts, baby onesies. There's no switchblades on there yet, but God willing, there will be one day. So check that out. Stickers, everything over at norsecode.threadless.com. And a special announcement that over in Eagan, Minnesota, December 12th, over at the Union 32 Craft House, we will be having our next live show. So that will be involving giving tickets away to the Monday night game for the Bears shortly after that date. So December 12th, Union 32 Craft House. We had such a great time last time. We're coming back. Eagan, Minnesota. Be there for that. It should be fantastic. We're giving stuff away. It should be great. And let's get into the show. We have an interview that Arif conducted earlier today with Scott Mason from the Play Like a Jet podcast. And I believe he's been on the show before. We've had people from Play Like a Jet on before, right?
Yeah, no, it was Scott specifically. Yeah, we've had him on before. I think we had him on last year.
Yep, that sounds great. So we're going to go to an interview that Arif conducted earlier today.
All right, I'm here with Scott Mason from the Play Like a Jet podcast. I was just on his show. Pleasure having him on. We've had him on previously to discuss the Jets roster and, having a good breakdown of what the Jets can do. And I'd say he passed the test, so we invited him back. How you doing?
Arif, it's always an honor to be on the show, and it's great to talk to you. As I've said, and I'm not just saying this because we're talking right now, you are one of my favorite people to talk to about football and about life in general. So it's great to be able to be on here and talk some Jets Vikings with you.
Fantastic, man. I'm really glad to hear that. That's awesome. So, the Vikings going up against the Jets last year was supposed to be kind of a Rodgers versus Vikings breakdown in a different kind of green uniform. Didn't happen. We've got it this year. And it's happening in London. So there's going to be a couple of changes to the way these teams prepare for these games, the way that they organize their practice schedules, the way that they do stuff like film breakdowns, get their sleep in, that kind of stuff. So it's going to be a little bit interesting how these teams approach that. But at the end of the day, it's a Jimmy's and Joe's game, right? It's about the people on the roster. So we're going to do a bit of a roster breakdown with Scott. And first, I just wanted to talk about kind of the headline of the Jets. It's Aaron Rodgers, right? Like the Jets are starting 2-2, I think. How has Aaron Rodgers played? Because the statistics aren't great, but it is Aaron Rodgers.
So I don't think he was all that good this past game when they lost against Denver, but it seems like a big part of the issue was he's not entirely on the same page with some of these players, especially Garrett Wilson. The other games, it was weird. In San Francisco, I thought he played fairly well. He wasn't by any means amazing, but I thought he played pretty well, made some nice throws. The game against Tennessee, he struggled early. He looked confused at times. He looked a little tentative. But then as time wore on, he got more comfortable, and the Jets were able to pull it out. The way I described that Tennessee game was, it reminds me of the old champion boxer who's not quite as good as he used to be, but he's still one of the best. He's not maybe the best anymore, but he's still such a wily veteran and has such a deep bag of tricks that push comes to shove, he's able to dig in at the end and do what he needs to do to get the victory. Almost like he's in there with a younger guy who takes the first 4 rounds, and then the older fighter figures out what the younger fighter is doing, and down the stretch is able to win enough rounds to come out on top on the scorecards. That's sort of what it felt like against Tennessee. And then everybody saw on national television the Patriots, the Jets absolutely demolished them. Now, part of that is the Patriots aren't that good, but the narrative before that was that the Patriots defense was plucky, that they were pretty good, and that maybe the Jets were underestimating the Patriots and it was going to be a tougher game than people expected, and yet the Jets went out there and destroyed them. And then you have the Denver game. So it's been weird. I think overall, Rodgers has been good. I don't know if I'd say he's been great. He's certainly been a significant improvement over what they've had, other than this past Denver game, which was sort of frustrating because Arif, one of the biggest problems with the Zach Wilson era Jets, putting aside the turnovers and all that, is that Zach Wilson would move the ball. He'd move the ball up and down the field, but they'd get to a certain point and no further. And so they'd either have to settle for a field goal attempt or they would come away with no points and have to punt. And that's more or less what you saw with Rodgers. And a lot of that, of course, and this is not Zach Wilson or Aaron Rodgers' fault, was penalties too, right? Because we saw that last year when the Jets played the Raiders. I was at that game in Vegas, and there were several penalties that just absolutely broke the Jets back. Every time it looked like they were driving to get meaningful points, they'd get pushed back, and then there's no way they'd get a touchdown, and sometimes they wouldn't even get any points at all. And you saw that against Denver. They had 13 penalties for 91 yards. The first 3 games, that had been improved, but in this game, they slid back to what Saleh has been known for, because the Jets have been the seventh most penalized team in the NFL since Saleh took over as head coach in 2021. And so those penalties kept shooting them in the foot, and then the Jets would move the ball, and they just weren't able to sustain these drives deep inside the territory of the Denver Broncos. The key there, I think, in that game more than anything else, though, was they had a drive where they got down to the 1-yard line. They had 1st and goal from the 1, and they were unable to punch the ball in. Twice they handed the ball to Breece Hall, then they threw it. It went incomplete. I don't know why they didn't give the ball to Braylon Allen, but what I'm saying here ultimately about Rodgers is his performance has sort of been like what we've seen from the Jets as a whole, I think. It's been good. It's been solid. It hasn't been great. It hasn't been Aaron Rodgers level quite yet. Will it get there, or is this just who he is now? Are they going to get on the same page? Is he going to get on the same page with some of these players like Garrett Wilson, or is this going to be a bumpy ride? These are questions that have to be ironed out throughout the season. Right now, it's a team with a lot of potential. Rodgers is a guy who has shown you that there are still bits and pieces of what made him so great, and he's able to bring them out at times, especially when he's given time to throw. Against the Broncos, very different story. They blitzed him so much, which in past years, as you know, Arif, he made opposing defenses pay for that big time. Wasn't able to make the Broncos pay for it. So is that something that you look at now going forward, that maybe Rodgers isn't going to be that force against the blitz, and maybe blitzing him is something that you can do now to great effect, whereas in the past you couldn't? So these are things that in a small sample size you don't know for sure, but it's curious to see going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting because the Broncos are the only other team who has a blitz rate that's even close to Minnesota's right now. So, using that as a potential game plan could be fascinating. And I think it impacts that that chemistry that you were talking about, right? Without chemistry, it's difficult to beat the blitz because you trust those receivers to read the blitz the same as you do. With that in mind, would you say that given that we've got 4 full games of Rodgers, so we're pretty early relatively speaking. Obviously, last year we didn't get any full games. Would you say that you're disappointed in the Rodgers era so far? Not in Aaron Rodgers, maybe necessarily, but in the Rodgers era?
Yes and no. Yes, because I was expecting more from the offense outside of that Patriot game. Not that I expected them to score 45 points a game, but I expected it to be easier for them. Obviously, we know what happened against San Francisco. Tennessee, they struggled. They were able to get the win, but it was tough. And then that game against Denver, where they only came away with 9 points at home. It's just, and they weren't able to capitalize on the fact that they were up against a rookie quarterback who threw for 60 total yards in the game. That's definitely a big disappointment. Now, I'm not going to go too crazy about it because it's only been 4 games, but you can see why. And obviously, we're taping this before anything would have happened. So if anything happens after we discuss this, you'll know that it's not that we're leaving it out. It's just it wouldn't have happened yet. If the Jets go and get Davante Adams, you can see why, because going into the season, Arif, Davante Adams to me was what dessert usually is, right? Nice, but not necessary. If they got him, cool. If they don't, he's not. It's not like they need him per se. They have Garrett Wilson. They had signed Mike Williams. Alan Lazard, has some chemistry with Rodgers. You figured he'd be okay. They drafted Malachi Corley in the 3rd round out of Western Kentucky. So you figured they had enough. Plus Tyler Conklin, your old friend who used to be on the Minnesota Vikings. But now with him having trouble getting on the same page with Garrett Wilson, with Alan Lazard definitely being better than last year, but still being sort of a jag receiver, with Malachi Corley falling behind and the coaching staff, Robert Saleh making comments about him being behind several other receivers on the roster, which you can only assume means Xavier Gibson, who offers nothing as a receiver. So that's a weird comment. Now, all of a sudden, the offense and the pass catchers don't look as deep. And Tyler Conklin, outside of that game against New England, has been a non-factor. So there's another one, Jeremy Ruckert, who everybody liked out of Rutgers, partly because he was a local kid. Everybody was expecting him to do something and be a solid tight end, and he hasn't been able to do that. And I think this goes back to what we were talking about with Rodgers. It's only been 4 games, but the assumption was that Rodgers would lift everybody's level of play, that Breece Hall and Garrett Wilson especially would go to that next tier. And I don't think we've seen that. And the question now, of course, is that Rodgers, or is it just these guys are not necessarily as good as we thought they were? And I think it might be a combination of both because, and we'll talk about this, but Garrett Wilson, really good player, very talented, one of the better receivers in the league. But you guys see, as Vikings fans, Justin Jefferson every week. Garrett Wilson's not in that same league. And I think that's become clearer once he has somebody like Aaron Rodgers throwing him the ball, as opposed to Zach Wilson, Mike White, Joe Flacco, Josh Johnson, and all that. Breece Hall, everybody thought maybe he's right up there with Christian McCaffrey. All he needed was a better offensive line, Aaron Rodgers helping him make plays. Well, he's getting outplayed by a 4th-round rookie in Braylon Allen. And that's the thing. You could look at it normally and say, well, what do you want from him? The offensive line. No matter what you think about how the offensive line is playing, and I think overall they've been a significant improvement from the last couple of years, when there's another running back there who is clearly outperforming the guy, you can't blame it on the offensive line at that point. You just have to look at it and say he's not as explosive as we expected. So on the one hand, yes, so far I'd say I'm a little disappointed. On the other hand, as the great Lou Brown, the late James Gammon, who played the role in the movie Major League, would say, relax, we got a whole bunch of these games to go. So I'm not going to stress about it too much yet. But yeah, the first 4 games, it's been a bit of a bumpier ride than I think a lot of people expected.
You kind of referenced what my next question was going to be, which is really nice, which is Braylon Allen better than Breece Hall?
Well, it's sort of interesting, Arif, right? Because I think this is why a lot of times you hear people say, don't draft a running back high, don't pay a running back. And there are always exceptions. I know he's hurt right now, and I know he's been banged up a lot, but Christian McCaffrey, when he plays, he's just an enormous difference maker. There's no way around it. No matter what you think about running backs, and I know you and I joked when we taped for Play Like a Jet about that website, running backs don't matter. And
right.
A lot of running backs don't, but Christian McCaffrey does. And there are a handful of guys that they really are impactful. A lot of it is because what they can do in the passing game. And I think with Breece Hall, everybody said, look at what this guy can do in the passing game. Look at what a dynamic runner he is. And that's why he's such a valuable player. That's why he could be one of those rare true difference makers at the running back position. But you look at him this year, and he's made a couple of plays in the passing game. He made one really nice touchdown catch against Tennessee on, 50-50 one-on-one situation. But beyond that, there just hasn't been a lot of explosive plays. And as you alluded to, Braylon Allen has outplayed him. He got in during that Tennessee game and looked really good. He got more touches against New England and continued to look good. And then you look at what happened against the Broncos. Braylon Allen averaged almost 4.5 yards a carry, and Breece Hall had 10 carries for 4 yards. That's 0.4 yards per carry. So you look at one running back who is very productive and the other one who's struggling mightily, and you have to ask yourself what's going on here. Now, again, and I'm going to keep saying this, and pardon me for being repetitive here, but it's only been 4 games. So maybe it's just a matter of Breece Hall sort of figuring out what to do here. Maybe the Denver game in particular was a bad matchup, all of that. But so far this year, I don't think there's any question that Braylon Allen has both outplayed and passed the eye test in terms of being a better player than Breece Hall, certainly as a pure running back. So whether that continues the rest of the season, the other 13 games of the year, I don't know. But Braylon Allen looks fresher. He looks more dynamic. Breece Hall just doesn't look to be the player that Jets fans expected. And you have to wonder if this continues, if Braylon Allen is going to start getting the lion's share of the carries, because if you want to win games in the NFL, you got to go with the guy that's producing, no matter what the name on the back of the jersey is. And if Braylon Allen continues to outproduce Breece Hall, they've got to switch horses and make Braylon Allen the primary back. So it's up to Breece Hall to turn this around and start to look more like the guy that everybody thought he'd be.
So, kind of one element of this offensive underperformance is that relationship with receivers. You mentioned this, that, Aaron Rodgers, Garrett Wilson don't really seem to have as much of a connection. I'm curious, like, when you kind of remove yourself from just the box score, right? When you just take a look at Garrett Wilson's play, whether it's film analysis or just kind of, your understanding of the way people are talking about him or whatever, you mentioned, hey, we're at a spot where we can pretty comfortably determine he's not an elite receiver, but is he playing well and the styles don't mesh? Is he playing well and Aaron Rodgers is not, meeting him where he's at? Or is he actually, playing maybe not as well as one would hope for a guy who's supposed to be emerging as a wide receiver one?
I'm going to be very anti-sports talk radio here and try and talk with nuance on this one, Arif, because sure. I think you know this, and this is why I love talking to you, because you are very nuanced and you bring a lot of great information and you're very intelligent with the way you break these things down. And so I'm going to try my best to sort of live up to that standard when I'm on your show. I think with Garrett Wilson, he's been good, but not anything beyond that. And that's very disappointing for a player who everybody expected to ascend to that all-pro level. Now, is part of that because he's just not as good as we thought? Probably. Is part of that because he just can't get on the same page with Aaron Rodgers? Probably. Is part of that because he's facing double teams every game or getting blanket covered by the opposing team's lockdown corner like we saw with the Broncos this past week as Patrick Surtain was on him the whole game? Sure. But ultimately, I think when you look at what he's been producing with Aaron Rodgers as opposed to what he produced with Zach Wilson, Joe Flacco, Mike White, it's curious that his production is actually worse to this point than it was with those guys. And the excuse of, well, he's double covered every game. Okay, fine. But Arif, how many times is Justin Jefferson double covered? You're not going to beat the double coverage every game. But if you're that level of receiver, you should be beating it more often than you're not beating it. How many times has Justin Jefferson been covered by one of the top corners in the league? Not saying you have to beat everybody. You could have a bad game against Patrick Surtain or somebody like that. But if you're that level of receiver, you should be getting the better of that matchup more often than you don't. And we're not seeing that with Garrett Wilson. And then you go back and look at a couple of other things. Look, all the best receivers have drops. You look at drop rates. so many of these guys drop a lot of passes. And a big part of that is, as you know, you can't just look at raw numbers. When you look at percentage of the targets, you're going to see these guys get so many targets that, of course, they're going to lead the league in drops and such. But there are a lot of times in big moments where Garrett Wilson will drop a pass that it looks like he probably should have caught. He will have fumbles that he shouldn't have. He had one against the Denver Broncos. And his frame has always been something that I've been a little bit nervous about. For a guy who you would think is going to be a number one receiver, he's built fairly slightly in frame. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he can't be that level of receiver, but it makes it tougher. So I think what we've seen from Garrett Wilson is that it's a combination of factors that have led us to this. But I think through the first 4 games, to me, the conclusion you draw is that Garrett Wilson is really, really good, but I don't think he's Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill, Devontae Adams. He's not that alpha number one wide receiver who 90% of games is just going to take over if you give him the opportunity. I think he's a guy that's a 1,000 to 1,200 yard receiver potentially, really, really good player, could be a low-end number one, like a number one receiver on a fair amount of teams. But in terms of just being that A-level guy, I don't think he's quite there. And I don't know if that's something he's capable of turning into. And I think the reasons that we've seen it this year is, like I said, a little of column A, a little of column B, a little of column C, a little of column D. But this is the conclusion that I've drawn from the first 4 games. Happy he's here. Love the fact that he's on a rookie deal. He's a very potent weapon. And I think that eventually his performance will start to kick up a little bit beyond what we've seen so far. But I'm now far less confident that he's going to ascend to that level that everybody thought he would with Aaron Rodgers than when the trade was made for Rodgers in the first place. I think he may just be that low-end 1, high-end 2 territory, which is very good to have, but it's not necessarily that home run hitter that the Jets thought that he was going to be with Aaron Rodgers in this offense.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Unfortunate for Jets fans after, that strong rookie showing. There are a couple of other receivers on the roster. Obviously, Alan Lazard, I believe, leads the Jets in receiving yards, which is curious, but obviously he's got a history with Rodgers. Mike Williams, who, from my understanding, started off slow because of injury, didn't get a ton of snaps in the first 2 games. I'm kind of curious about what his role is expected to be in London. You already talked about Malachi Corley, seems to be a little bit in the doghouse for whatever reason. How has the rest of that receiving group kind of adapted to the offensive reality that they're in?
It's interesting because Mike Williams, I think, at this point is looking more and more like he may end up as the top receiver for the Jets. Every time Rodgers targets him, it seems to wind up in a first down. 4 catches for 67 yards against Denver. All 4 of them were for first downs. And late in the game, he was able to draw a huge penalty that brought the Jets downfield for what eventually wound up in a missed Greg Zuerlein field goal attempt. But the point is, with Williams, I think he's perfectly tailored to what Aaron Rodgers likes to do. Now, Arif, we know that Rodgers is not one who loves to throw over the middle, right? He likes to throw go balls down the field. He likes to throw short passes that are open, that give a lane for the receiver to get yards after the catch. That's more in his wheelhouse than anything else. And Mike Williams is perfect because we call it a 50-50 ball when you throw the ball up and it's a one-on-one. But when it's Mike Williams, it's like a 90-10 ball because he's coming down with that ball almost every single time. And so I think he's been each week getting more and more and more important to this offense. Alan Lazard is interesting because he's been more the receiver that you saw in Green Bay, which is an okay receiver, nothing special, but a guy who's at least useful, whereas last year he was absolutely terrible. And you have to attribute at least a good portion of that to the chemistry he has with Aaron Rodgers. But then again, as my friend Glenn pointed out the other day, Alan Lazard was having balls just straight up bounce off his hands last year. That's not Zach Wilson's fault. So for as much as some of it is because of Rodgers, some of it is also just he happens to be playing better, period. And so when you look at that and you see, like I said, what Garrett Wilson has done so far, which is not been eye-popping by any stretch. You see a group of receivers that everybody had very high hopes for that have been sort of a mediocre-ish group, although Williams, as he's played more each week, has made more and more of a difference, and I do expect him to get targeted quite a bit. If the Jets get down into the red zone, certainly Aaron Rodgers will take shots to him deep downfield and into the end zone. Malachi Corley is a funny one because I was a huge Malachi Corley fan. He was my favorite player in the draft. I just looked at him and said, this guy is completely perfect for what Rodgers likes to do. Rodgers loves to throw short passes where the receiver takes it and goes and gets yards. This guy was the yak king at college. He averaged close to 10 yards per reception, which means every time he averaged almost 10 yards every time he touched the ball. And I don't mean per reception. I misspoke there. I mean, like once he'd get the ball, he would get you that many yards almost.
10 yards after the catch.
Yes. So almost every single time. I think it was like 9 yards after the catch or something. So that's, for a guy like Rodgers, perfect. And Rodgers himself spoke about how he watched tape on Corley and basically told Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh, go get me that guy. But then you hear stories about, the route tree and he's behind these other receivers, which is what Robert Saleh said during his presser the other day. And you wonder, is it something with him and Rodgers not clicking? Is it that they're just being stubborn? Because we did see this with Denzel Mims when they got here. Denzel Mims had been fairly productive under Adam Gase after he came back from injury. And everybody was excited about him coming off that rookie year. And then he couldn't even get on the field his second year. And even when he eventually got opportunities, he self-destructed. And it got to the point where you wonder, does the coaching staff just not like this kid for some reason? What's going on? Because you can't sit here and tell me, he doesn't know all the routes. It's not like Malachi Corley can't come on the field and just, hey, throw the ball to him and have him run 6-7 yards. Like there are plays that you can devise to play to his strengths, obviously. So something seems a little bit off there, as it was with Denzel Mims. And I know Denzel Mims didn't produce after he left the Jets, but my theory has always been that his experience with the Jets rattled him so badly that mentally he never recovered. We'll never know that for sure, but that's always kind of been my theory.
I'll buy it. I was a huge Denzel Mims guy, so I'll take it.
Yeah, and you know his story, Arif. He was a small town kid from Texas. He even made those comments before the draft about being scared of Philly. So I wonder if the early days with Sal and LaFleur beating him down mentally, that was a case where he just was somebody that wasn't capable of recovering. But either way, you would think that the coaching staff would try and get Malachi Corley in there. Instead, they're bringing in Xavier Gibson and targeting him on go balls downfield, which makes no sense for a 5'9" guy. So the receiving core and Tyler Conklin, who's not technically a receiver, he had that one really nice game against the New England Patriots, but other than that, he's been a non-factor. So the receiving core has been a disappointment. Lazard's been better than last year. People have been pleasantly surprised by that. And Mike Williams is starting to catch steam. But overall, this group has not done anything that would make you think they're an upper tier group outside of that one Patriots performance, which hopefully isn't an aberration. We'd like to see more of that going forward. But so far, to answer your question, the receiving group has been somewhat lacking, especially considering what the expectations were.
All right, well, it seems like if they do trade for Devontae Adams, he probably wouldn't be in London in time for a game. So no worries there for me, at least. I would hope. Okay, so super quick, just want to touch on the tight ends before we get to the offensive line and then head to talking about the defense. But you've already talked a little bit about how Tyler Conklin's had one good game, but it was mostly Jeremy Ruckert eating into those snaps. Unfortunately for me, the one game where I took the Tyler Conklin under was the Patriots game. Very frustrating. I really thought I had the market on that one. But it seems like Ruckert, who I think the Jets drafted in as part of that ridiculous rookie class with Breece Hall and Sauce Gardner and Garrett Wilson, seems like Ruckert is really coming into his own. Is that providing at least some level of intermediate threat to kind of supplement what has been a kind of disappointing receiving performance?
Ruckert has been a big disappointment. I think a lot of people expected more from him, and he just hasn't really given the Jets much as a tight end. Conklin was a guy that has flashed, and as you know, he was productive in Minnesota, and everybody just thought, well, now that Rodgers is here, obviously he's going to elevate everybody, including Ruckert and Conklin. And again, other than that New England game, it just hasn't really happened so far. That kid whose name escapes me, who had a really good preseason for the Bears and who the Jets made a waiver claim on when he got released. I'm trying to remember what his name is. I think it starts with a G, his last name. But he's somebody that a lot of people are wondering if maybe he gets a shot at some point over Ruckert. I think Ruckert, to me, his best performances have been at fullback, strangely enough, although he had some missed blocks against the Broncos and all of that. But you were hoping for more production from the tight end spot, and other than that one game from Conklin, you just haven't seen it yet. So it's a weird group, and the Jets have historically had a weird relationship with the tight end position. Before Conklin, the last time they had a useful receiving tight end was Dustin Keller, and he was fine, but he was nothing special. And then you go back to Johnny Mitchell, same thing, fine, but nothing special. The only tight end I shouldn't say recent memory because we're talking the 80s now. Yeah. In the last couple of decades, who's really been a plus, a real factor as a receiver is Mickey Schuler. And like I said, you got to go back to the 80s for that one. So the Jets are just not a team that typically gets a ton of production out of the tight end. And unfortunately, we thought that would change this year with Conklin, and it may the next 13 games, but it hasn't so far.
Cool. Let's talk super quick about that offensive line. Elijah Vera-Tucker seems to be playing well. The rest of that group, I'm not confident I can say that, which sucks because that includes Tyron Smith near the end of his career. Doesn't seem to be playing all that well. Morgan Moses, again, injured. I don't know if he's going to be available to play. We saw Olu Fashanu play a little bit. That didn't seem great, but he is a first-round pick. I think that a lot of people expected him to play. And him being kind of in mostly as an injury replacement is maybe disappointing, but I think more disappointing has been his level of play. What about this offensive line? And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's playing well. Maybe Joe Tippmann's playing well, and I didn't mention him. I don't know. Tell me more about this offensive line and kind of how Denver, overwhelmed it, what the Vikings could do to overwhelm it, and then we can talk about the defense.
So the offensive line has certainly been a lot better this year than it's been in past years. And I think the pass protection until the Denver game has mostly been fairly solid. The first game, they were a little rough, especially run blocking. But I think it's one of those cases where it's sort of that old economist axiom, right? Where you say, oh, this is really bad. And then the economist says, compared to what? Because you have to compare it to the previous conditions or what the reasonable expectations are. I think the Jet offensive line, pass protecting wise, has been a huge improvement. Up until this Denver game, Aaron Rodgers has had quite a bit of time to throw. He's got the quick release, but still. Elijah Vera-Tucker is the one who's been really, really good. Moses was good before he got hurt, and he will not play in this game, by the way. I'm hoping that he's back for the Bills game when the Jets come back from the UK, but he will not play in this game. Olu is interesting. He's a guy that, as you know, is a pure left tackle at Penn State, and so this offseason they work with him at right tackle because they wanted him to be ready in case they needed him, because Moses, as we know, came off surgery for a torn pec, which he played with all year last year. What a madman. I have no idea how he managed to do that. 300-pound men trying to take you down every play, and you've got a torn pec. Incredible.
Jeez, yeah.
So you had to think there was a possibility something might happen to him. And then obviously Tyron Smith, as we know, he hasn't played a full season in years. The Cowboys' strategy has been to put him in bubble wrap all week, and it seemed to work. 13 games last year, which is plenty. If the Jets could get 13 healthy games out of him, you'd be happy. But Olu playing at right tackle, a position where, he took some snaps in the summer, but he's not really comfortable there. I kept telling people, lower your expectations. If he can at least be decent, if he can tread water, you should be thrilled with that. And, of course, he wasn't. He got destroyed. You take or leave the PFF rankings, but you can also just watch with your own two eyes. He was absolutely annihilated by the Broncos. And like you said, the Vikings have a similar blitz rate. I have to assume Brian Flores knows his football. He's going to look at that tape. He's going to see what the Denver Broncos did to Olu at right tackle. And I would imagine he's going to try to devise ways to do the same thing against him in the UK in this matchup. Tyron Smith has been better than what the Jets have gotten, but also he's clearly seemed to have lost a bit of a step, gave up 3 sacks for the first time in his career. And part of that is him just getting older. Part of that is maybe he just can't handle the constant blitzing the way that he used to. So he's been mostly okay, but not the Tyron Smith that you've seen in past years in Dallas. And then you've got John Simpson, and you kind of knew what he was. He's an okay guard with a nasty streak and a penchant for penalties. And that's more or less what he's been so far. And that's fine. He's an okay starting guard, which everybody on the line can't be awesome. Joe Tippmann had played at a Pro Bowl level the first 3 games. He did not play well against the Denver Broncos. The entire line really struggled. AVT was okay, but for the rest of that line, it was a tough day. So again, you have to wonder, with the Broncos having that level of success with the constant blitzes, and especially with Olu looking completely lost out there, is that something Brian Flores is going to do and try and copy that Denver blueprint? I would imagine that he would.
All right. It largely sounds optimistic for the Vikings defense against the Jets offense. We'll see how that goes. The other side of the ball, the Jets last year were really incredible up front. They were kind of characterized by how good their pass rush was, getting a ton of different pressures from a ton of different players. Obviously, Quinnen Williams played a big role in that, but that stable of edge rushers was big. But they lost Jonathan Franklin Myers. They don't have Bryce Huff. They brought in Hassan Reddick, who had an understanding of what the contract negotiation process would look like. That understanding did not match the Jets' understanding, maybe is the most diplomatic way I could put that. It has not reported. Jermaine Johnson just went on IR. Will McDonald has 5 sacks or something like that. That seems nice. I don't know that this defensive line, and we can talk about, Will McDonald, we can talk about Michael Clemens, we can talk about, Tack McKinley, we can also talk about that interior. Javon Kinlaw, I think a lot of people expected more out of. Quinnen Williams obviously has not been playing up to the level that he did last year, at least so far. Former Viking defensive end, defensive tackle Jalen Holmes is there. Solomon Thomas, charcuterie board guy, is there. Tell me about this group and why it just feels kind of flat.
I think a lot of it is they just don't have the depth that they've had in previous years, and some of the best players on that line left and weren't necessarily adequately replaced. So if you look at last year, the 5 best pass rushers on the Jets defensive line were Quinnen Williams, obviously. And then from there, you had Bryce Huff, you had John Franklin Myers, you had Jermaine Johnson, and you had Quentin Jefferson inside. So what's happened since then? Well, as you said, Quinnen's been good to very good, but he hasn't been that dominant force that you expect. And I think part of that is probably because all the focus has been on him. But Jermaine Johnson, who wasn't a great pass rusher last year, but was good and showed room for growth. Overall, very good player, though, good against the run and all that. He's out for the year, gets hurt in that second game of the season against Tennessee. John Franklin Myers traded for peanuts to the Denver Broncos, and they did that under the assumption that he was going to be replaced by Hassan Reddick. But as you said, Hassan Reddick's not here, and it doesn't look like he's ever coming in. So John Franklin Myers, for whatever you want to say about him, versatile player, could play inside, outside, good against the run, good against the pass, good for 50 pressures a year, 4 years in a row, doesn't miss games. By no means an all-world player. Wasn't anything amazing, but he was a reliable, stable presence there, and he's gone. Bryce Huff, I know he's been terrible in Philadelphia, but he gave the Jets a good amount of production, especially last year. He was their second most efficient and effective pass rusher. He's not here. And so what the Jets have had to rely on really so far is Will McDonald taking a big step up. And McDonald has played fairly well, but this is one of those cases where the box score isn't as the box score is more impressive than what you actually see, because he has 5 sacks, but if you go and look at those sacks, most of them were from unblocked attempts at the quarterback, or there was even one where he fell down and the quarterback tripped and he touched the quarterback, stuff like that, where other guys were the reason for the sack and he just got the sack. So he's definitely been better, but he hasn't been that number 1 caliber pass rusher that they really need. And because they've lost so much from last year and they haven't replaced it, it's been an uphill battle. Now, the first couple of weeks, they had good pressure rates, and I would argue a lot of that was inflated because the New England Patriots have an absolutely terrible offensive line. But if you look at what happened with Denver, 0 sacks against Bo Nix, for example. So I think a big part of this is they just lost a lot of guys, and I don't think they adequately replaced them. Now, part of it is I don't think Javon Kinlaw is going to be as effective as a pass rusher as Quentin Jefferson over the long haul of the season. I know he made some strides last year, but overall, I think Jefferson was a better pure pass rusher. And then you look at the edge rusher spot, and all you have is let's cross our fingers and hope Will McDonald is better. No other upgrade because Jermaine Johnson out. Bryce Huff gone. John Franklin Myers gone. Hassan Reddick not here. So that's really what it comes down to is this unit is just not the same unit that we've seen in years past. And especially this past week and that first week against the San Francisco 49ers, you saw clearly that they're hurting there and they need help. And then against the run, Lecky Fatu, who's a very effective run stuffer who they brought in from the Arizona Cardinals, he's supposed to play in this game. He's off injured reserve, so hopefully he helps there. I don't think he's going to do much against the pass rush, though.
That's unfortunate. This is a very depressing podcast from a Jets perspective.
Well, you know what it is, Arif? It's not that the Jets have been bad so far, but look, when you lose a game...
We have high expectations, yeah.
Yeah, when you watch them lose a game 10-9 at home, when a rookie quarterback on the other side throws for 60 yards, it takes a lot out of you.
Yeah, well, I've been there. I understand. All right, well, that moves us up, I think, to that linebacker group. C.J. Mosley, not available from my understanding. So you've got Quincy Williams, you've got former Viking Chaz Surratt, another revenge game angle there, and some players that are listed at linebacker that I frankly do not recognize. So tell me about this linebacker unit and like how important it is to how well the Jets play, because I recall C.J. Mosley being really significant last year, and I know that Quincy Williams is playing out of his mind this year, but the Jets have not been playing up to the standard that they need to. So how important is this group anyway?
Well, it looks like C.J. Mosley actually is probably going to play. He was a full participant in practice, so we'll see what happens there. I will say this, though, Arif. It's funny. I felt like the linebackers look quicker without him, and this is nothing against C.J. Mosley, but you know the deal. Father Time waits for no man, so as good as he's played, he's slowed down each year a little bit, and Jamie and Sherwood stepped in, and I thought the defense looked quicker without C.J. Mosley, but now he'll be back. And like you said, you've got Quincy Williams, who's been an absolute madman again this year. Credit to that Jets coaching staff for developing him. That was a player that I just didn't understand the fascination with him the first few years, but they re-signed him, brought him back, continue to work with him, and now we know what he's turned into. So I think the Jets linebackers will be fine. Sherwood will probably get a good amount of snaps. Like you said, Chaz Surratt may get some opportunities, but it's not a unit I would really worry so much about. It's funny because I think what you saw against Denver was the Jets up front had a lot of trouble, but on the back end, covering the pass defense was very good. The DJ Reed, who I know you've referenced before, played arguably his best game as a Jet. Sauce Gardner, they didn't even try him really. And as I said, Bo Nix, 60 yards passing. And so I thought the linebackers weren't dreadful the way that they were with the defensive line and the pass rushers and all of that. And so it'll be interesting to see how C.J. Mosley affects this group going forward. But I think it'll certainly help them to have their leader back out there, if nothing else.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about that secondary. I mean, we just talked about DJ Reed a little bit. Obviously, there's Sauce Gardner. Pretty decent, I think, safety group with Tony Adams, Chuck Clark. I was a big Ashton Davis guy way back. Sounds like I shouldn't have been. But yeah, it feels like there is something pretty significant here. Obviously, we haven't seen it materialize in 4 excellent defensive games, but it feels like there's something pretty significant here in the overall level of play. Of course, I missed out on mentioning Michael Carter, who is their nickel. What is kind of your feeling of the temperature of this unit?
The safeties are okay. I mean, Tony Adams is nothing special. Chuck Clark is fine. The thing that's good about Chuck Clark is obviously the veteran leadership, and he's a player who's pretty versatile. He can play a little bit of linebacker if you need him to. He's a guy who's very good covering tight ends. He got off to a rocky start, but the last couple of weeks he's played pretty well. He made a really nice play against the Patriots, and I think overall he's starting to sort of gel. Remember, this is a guy who's coming off a very serious injury, and so for him to come back and start slow is not really all that surprising. So I would say that on paper, the Jets safety room is just so-so, but overall they've been fine. I don't think that they've been a unit that's really hurt them. I don't necessarily think they've been a strength, but I think if you looked at the names on paper before the season and said to yourself, okay, best case scenario, these guys will be an okay, decent unit, that's about what they've lived up to, and that's not a bad thing. Let me just really quickly touch on the cornerbacks because, Sauce Gardner, I would say, is if he's not the best corner in the league, he's right up there. And DJ Reed's certainly one of the best in the league. Michael Carter, an excellent slot corner. So there are those that would argue, and I think it's a fair argument to make, that corner is the biggest strength on the entire team. So that's one thing that I'm curious to see. How do the Jets deal with that potent passing attack that we've seen so far from the Vikings with Sam Darnold throwing to Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and such? But as far as the special teams go, look, I'm a big fan of Brent Boyer, the Jets special teams coach. He's been here through multiple different coaching regimes, and he's consistently done a very good job. Last week, Irv Charles, who is the special teams ace the Jets have, who's typically playing at a Pro Bowl-ish type of level, he made a really boneheaded mistake. He ran into the runner before the ball even landed in his hands on a punt return. But typically, he's been one of the best in the league. He had a block punt earlier this season. And I think Zerline has been one of the few kickers the Jets have had in recent years that has provided them with any sense of stability. But he had a little bit of trouble in the preseason, and that's carried over so far. He did miss a kick. Now, granted, it wasn't a chip shot. It was 49 yards in the rain, but still, he did miss a kick that would have given the Jets the lead and good chance that it would have given them the win against Denver this past Sunday. So he sort of lost a step. Thomas Morstead is doing what he always does. Look, when you get the level of compliments that he got from Mike Westhoff, who I believe in his book referred to Morstead as his favorite punter he's ever had. I mean, listen, we know Mike Westhoff doesn't throw compliments like that around willy-nilly. So he's the real deal. And in his late 30s, he's still punting as well as ever. So nothing too crazy on the special teams, but I am curious to see what happens if Greg Zuerlein is put in another one of those types of situations where he has to make a long kick to try and win the game. In the past years, you would have thought he should probably make it, but based on what we've seen in the preseason and this past week against Denver, a little bit more nervous about it now.
All right. Thank you so much. What are your thoughts on the game? I mean, Vikings favored by 2.5. I think when the season started, the Jets were favored by 3. A lot of significant changes in the perception of both teams going in. How do you think this plays out?
Well, it's interesting. I'm curious to see if, like we said, the Vikings are able to use that Broncos playbook and just go right after Aaron Rodgers and try and take advantage of Olu and try and take advantage of an offensive line that seemed to have trouble with the blitz, and with Rodgers, who seemed to have trouble with the blitz, which is not normally the case. I'm also curious to see if Sam Darnold is able to rise to the occasion against his old team and one of, if not the best cornerback groups in the entire NFL. What is Justin Jefferson able to do if the Jets put Sauce Gardner on him to trail all game, which they typically haven't done, but maybe against Justin Jefferson they will. They've started to open their minds to it a little bit, so we'll see. I think it could go either way, honestly, and the Jets desperately need this one because if they lose this one and they come back 2-3 going up against the Bills, their season could be on the verge of cratering. If they lose this one and lose to the Bills and they're 2-4, all of a sudden, in a very crowded AFC East, things take a turn. The Vikings probably aren't as hungry at 4-0. However, they've been playing such good football that at this point, you'd have to favor them to win this game, right? So I'll say this. I think it could go either way, but I think it's entirely possible that the Vikings get the Jets out of sorts early with those blitzes, with Flores calling the shots there, and are able to build a lead by playing into the Jets' weaknesses, which would be the running game and the short pass. And perhaps if the Vikings build that lead, it demoralizes the Jets. And even if the Jets are able to do what Green Bay did and score a bunch of points, they won't be able to close the gap. So I think there's a universe where the Jets win this game. Certainly, I don't think on paper the rosters are far apart, but I also think if you were forcing me to pick who's going to win based on what we've seen so far this season, you'd probably have to go with the Vikings.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Where can people find you? What do you have to plug?
Well, Arif, first of all, always an honor coming on. I always love talking to you about, like I said, the Jets, the Vikings, and pretty much anything else in this crazy walk of life, or as Stevie Ray Vaughan used to say, in this madness of life. You can find me on Twitter at PlayLikeAJet1. Our YouTube channel is youtube.com/PlayLikeAJet. Luke Grant, the Thunder from Down Under, does some awesome all 22 film reviews on there. It's great. They're usually like 10 to 15 minutes. So if you want to learn and see the game film and get it broken down, but not have it be super long and complex, if you want it in sort of a Reader's Digest kind of way, it's a great way to do it. You can subscribe so that you don't miss any new videos. We've got our store, teepublic.com. That's teepublic.com. And the podcast, which is available, believe it or not, Arif, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, except on leap years, because then it's not 365 days. But every single day, new episode. It's on Spotify, Apple, Google, Stitcher, anywhere you download podcasts. And again, it was a pleasure and a privilege joining you. Really appreciate you having me on. Look forward to doing it again soon.
Awesome.
All right, let's go to the mailbag. And the first question is for Richard Seymour's divorce. And the question is, how is England for James and Arif if you learn the German ways? England's fantastic. It's a lot like North Dakota for some reason. I don't understand how they also have a sugar beet season, but here we are.
Yeah, no, as I said at the top of the show, Germany's been great. I haven't quite figured out all the German ways. Driving on the wrong side of the street, which I guess I didn't expect. That's a little bit weird. The cabs are unusual, but if you tell them like where you want to go, like they don't need anything else. They just know immediately what you're talking about. Super expensive though. So that's the kind of the trade-off. Great metro system here in Munich. I think they call it the tube or something like that. Very odd. But yeah, no, I'm kind of picking up what they're putting down. There's a little bit of cultural exchange happening here. It's a process.
The real unfortunate thing is if I was going to visit London, and I had spoken to Arif about this at one point, I was going to ensure that we made it over to the German embassy just to say we'd actually been to German soil.
Yeah,
so,
that would have been so fun.
That would have been great. However, let's go to our next question. That's from Zach Dixon, who asks, is the amount of yards allowed a concern for the long-term sustainability of how good the defense can be?
So I haven't exactly looked this up, but my impression is that in the final 5 minutes of the game, the Vikings have given up something like 250 yards. If that's not the exact stat, it is something close to it. Remember, we had like about 90-ish yards from the Houston Texans. We had 96 yards from the Green Bay Packers in those final drives, and obviously there was that drive from San Francisco. So it's pretty high how much of that comes in the final 5 minutes. And as you might recall from those games, that didn't matter.
Garbage
for most
time.
Of
the word garbage time comes to mind.
Yeah, that's probably the phrase that I would use for that. As far as like total yards is concerned, I have found no evidence that suggests that total yards given up is a meaningful metric for predicting the performance of defenses going forward, especially as it regards to points allowed per drive or points allowed. So that's just not a question to me. If you exclude garbage time, the Vikings are like a top 3 team, depending on your definition of garbage time, whether it's, outside of 90% win probability, outside of 95% win probability, whatever that definition is. If you exclude garbage time, The Vikings are just a top 3 defense in EPA per play, in success rate, and particularly in stuff like drop back rate, which is kind of where a lot of these yards are coming from. It's coming through the air. The Vikings are like number 1 in the NFL in total yards allowed while passing, which is interesting because like per attempt, they're 22nd, and that's most to least. So in terms of like how good the defense is, they're 11th, right? And again, a lot of these are occurring in garbage time. The vast proportion of the yards that are being generated against the Vikings. So I'm not concerned about it. Maybe later I'll look up a statistic using StatHead, who is sort of sponsoring Wide Left, kind of. Using StatHead to maybe exclude some of the late fourth quarter stuff, because the Vikings have not been in a high leverage situation in the fourth quarter. I'm not concerned about excluding that and poisoning the results that way. So no, not a huge deal.
Let's go to Hitman Stan, who asks, do you think Flores will be doing less disguising of coverages in the matchup against the Jets?
No, I think it's just kind of embedded in what they do. They don't use that many different coverages. It's a fairly, on the back end in terms of coverage, it's a fairly basic is kind of the wrong word, but it doesn't have simple, maybe is the better word, actually. It doesn't have the complexity of coverage types that you might get from a Mike Zimmer defense. And it's primarily a too high defense, which is pretty funny given how often they blitz, right? So high blitz rate teams historically in the NFL have really high levels of cover one. That makes sense, right? Because if you're sending an extra person, you've got fewer players to cover zones. And so man coverage is the best way you can ensure that you're covering as much ground as possible. Otherwise, you might have to give up the flats. Well, the Vikings are comfortable giving up the flats. So there's a lot of cover 2, cover 4 in their DNA. And so they will probably default to one of those, but they do disguise a lot. I don't think that there's any reason to avoid that just because, now you've got an elite quarterback, because the Vikings disguise with a particular intent in mind, and giving Aaron Rodgers like the answers beforehand anyway probably isn't going to help you. So you probably try to gain as many advantages as possible and stick within the coaching and the installs that you've done.
Let's go to Alex, who asks, if Rodgers figures out the Vikings defense and has a good game, would that be cause for concern, or would we chalk it up to Rodgers being the most experienced, oldest player in the league, and chalk it up to him being able to decipher all of Flores' pre-snap disguise? Similar to how Jets fans will cope by saying JJ is the best receiver in the league, so it's okay that Sauce isn't going to man up on him.
That would be a cause for concern. Yeah, I think that's the best way to phrase it, but not one where you would like ring an alarm bell, right? Like, and I don't want to. Right now, the defense has set an expectation that they are going to be one of the best in the league. That's it. And so they will need to win games in the playoffs in concert with the offense. I think that despite how well Sam Darnold is playing, just won NFC Offensive Player of the Month, despite how good Justin Jefferson is, right? I think this seems like a defense-led team where the victories are being kind of produced a little bit more on defense than on offense. Now, the great thing about this team is that I could be wrong and that you can reasonably disagree with that. They're both very good, right? But my interpretation of this offense and this defense is that probably you'll need the defense to perform at a high level in the playoffs. That means doing well against high-level quarterbacks, many of whom have a lot of experience. So if you go up against Matthew Stafford in the playoffs, right? Like the Rams are not looking like they're going to be a top 4 seed. The Vikings might be a top 4 seed. So you could play the Rams in the first or even second round. You'll be going up against someone like Matthew Stafford, who has seen a lot of different defenses. If you can't do anything about a quarterback that has a lot of experience diagnosing, breaking down defenses, then you're going to have to be in a shootout, which is probably fine given the Rams defense. But I don't think that it's good to kind of have to lean on just one solution the whole time. So that would be a cause for concern. Not alarm bells, but something that they need to figure out going forward if they want to be successful, in the postseason. So, yeah, I think that if you say, well, that's just because Rodgers is the most experienced player, that does sound like hope, because at what point, you're trying to win all the games, right? So if there are some games where it's more understandable that you get carved up, sure, but the hope is that you're not getting carved up, right? So I think that that's it might recalibrate our expectations for the defense appropriately, but I think that we can't cope. We can't like put ourselves in a position where we're like, well, it's just going to happen.
Next question is from Michael Johnson, who asks, are the Vikings protesting the new kickoff return rules? I can't recall a kick from a record that hasn't gone in or through the end zone, with the result that our opponent is consistently starting on the 30. Is this a lack of confidence in our return team coverage, or is our rookie kicker unable to dial back his leg?
I think it's just to reduce variance. I think that, when you're doing the kickoff, that's a defensive play. And that's how like most coaches seem to see it. And if that's the case, you can ensure that, the opponent is just not going to break off a big play. Then you're probably fine. You're willing to sacrifice some average field position to avoid, some free points here or there, right? So it's not like a protest. It's a strategic decision. I very much enjoy that some teams have decided that their response to the new kickoff rule is going to be to try and exploit the difference between the different touchbacks, right? Because if the ball lands in the end zone, that brings it up to the 30, or goes out the back of the end zone, that brings it up to the 30. But if the ball lands in the landing zone and then rolls into the end zone, that brings the ball to the 20. And so you have an incentive to try and kick it to like the 1 and have it roll in. And some teams have kickers who have the ability to kick it that far downfield, right? And hook it so that it's really difficult to catch, but still lands at the 1 and then rolls in. It's happened a couple of times. That's really cool. It would be nice if the Vikings attempted that, because that is 10 yards. That's a huge advantage, right? I don't think that that's like a limitation of Will Reichard. I'd be curious if it was. Maybe that's the answer. But I think the Vikings are just like, hey, we can guarantee that there are no big plays. So that's what we'll do.
Let's go to Kyle Segal, who asks, considering Green Bay got beaten by a trash Eagles team and has victories over the beyond trash Colts and Titans, how bad should we feel about letting such a butt team nearly complete the comeback against us?
Didn't he write this question in about like the 49ers or something too?
Yeah, it's turning into that, yes. I'm not opposed to this bit if the Vikings keep winning, so.
Yeah, sure. Not a concern. You gotta beat the people in front of you. The Vikings did that. Green Bay did not actually complete a comeback or get close to completing a comeback. It feels like it because they were a couple plays away in theory, but there's a reason that the win probability marker was stuck firmly at 99% for the Vikings, because these onside kicks just don't get recovered. And if they do, they still have to, like, they have no timeouts left. They still have to engineer it. And Braden Narvison wasn't really clutching up that day. So, no, I'm not really that concerned. Kind
of amazed he's still on the team at this point. Not Your Father's Dopamine asks, do you think the English locals still hold a grudge over the Vikings for Lindisfarne? Wow.
Yeah, well, I'm in Germany right now, so I can't do an on-the-beat report. But the last time I was in Europe, I was in London for the Vikings-London game, and I did travel up to Lindisfarne to write a story about, the historical Vikings and the historical Saints. So, of course, I had to ask the locals then, what do you think about, the Minnesota Vikings coming to London? That's what the historical Vikings had been trying to do for so long. Go through, Northumbria, come down to Londinium, and take over for the Normans, right? And they all agreed. They were like, yeah, that makes sense that you would ask that question. They said it like that. And they all definitely hold a grudge. They're very embittered about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, not the part about you being in, Germany, but whatever. Brian Jellerson asks, if we win in London, is that considered a foreign product and therefore affected by the port strike? Should we start to stock up on wins, knowing that they may be delayed for a while?
You should always stock up on wins. One of the lessons that we learned from the pandemic is that just-in-time inventory processing management techniques are not really very effective. And that while it might be efficient in particular spans of time to produce wins as needed, It's not efficient over a long period of time, as black swan type events can impact your ability to access, just in time type of products. So it is expensive to maintain storage space. That is a concern, but overall, you're much more resilient as a company if you employ redundancies. And so for the Vikings, that would mean generating as many wins as early as possible, so that you don't have to worry about supply squeezes. But in this case, I don't think that is really a huge impact, because the Vikings are going to be flying their win back in. They will not be shipping the win via containers. And so that's not going to get stuck up in the port strike, unless there's like a cargo strike among cargo airplanes or something like that. And even then, like, the Vikings are probably just taking the win through the passenger airlines. So this one's pretty resilient to supply chain shocks.
Yeah, it's all they're really going to have to do is just declare it.
Yeah, just declare your victory, and customs, of course. But yeah, I think you're fine.
Let's go to Adam Bryant, who asks, since today is Tommy Wiseau's 69th birthday, what character do you think he would play in a movie about the Vikings franchise? I think I have an answer for this. I think that he should.
Okay.
I think he should play the caterer from the Randy Moss incident. Literally the first thing that came. Like, no, that's absolutely perfect.
Oh, hi, Moss.
Oh, hi, Moss. Yes, thank you. That was the logical conclusion to what we were doing. That's fantastic. Let's go to TankBee, who asks let's do the football one first. For Reefs, go with the flow corner. So far, Flores has had a lot of success in scheming up defensive plays that have left opposing quarterbacks rattled and looking completely out of sorts. However, this has been against 3 second-year starters and also Daniel Jones. Presumably, Aaron Rodgers will be a different caliber altogether, even if he's washed years of playing against the Vikings, along with the embarrassment of the loss to the Fighting Dusties out of Denver. It might be forgivable to think Rodgers may seem like the version we saw in Green Bay, rather than the one that we've seen play for the Johnson & Johnson vaccine machine. What sort of changes do you expect Flores? We've already basically answered this, but I don't care. It's a good question. What sort of changes do you expect to see Flores make for a quarterback less likely to be shaken by the pressure from blitzes and the mainstream media?
Well, one thing that we've learned from the mainstream media is that if you repeat something often enough, it'll stick. And I think that the analog here is that you're probably going to have some type of follow stunt or follow blitz, where you have multiple players enter the same gap. We haven't seen that a ton. We've seen it a little bit from the Minnesota Vikings, but Flores has seen, or rather, Rodgers has seen the Vikings do double A gap stuff, blitz from the edge, use their safeties as blitzers, use Ivan Pace as blitzing. Well, not Ivan Pace specifically. Rodgers was injured last year. But, like Anthony Barr, having linebackers blitz from the second level. He's seen all of it, and the Vikings will show all of it. But complicating the protection schemes by having a delayed blitzer come up the same gap as somebody who just stunted into that gap, that's something that takes time. You might not get home all that often, but it does really confuse, what's happening up front. And sometimes it can be so confusing that you're going to accidentally free up another rusher. So I think kind of, make sure that you're hammering in the same point of attack again and again. And, that's going to kind of bury Rodgers, which is the job of the mainstream media. So, yeah, I think that when push comes to shove, I think that the overwhelming weight of the establishment will probably, as represented by Brian Flores, of course, will probably, overwhelm Aaron Rodgers, which I think we all expected.
Yeah, obviously. Also from TankBee, for Reefs, we live in a society corner. I was recently requested to join an AI council for the company I work for. My boss, who likes me and does not think highly of the current use of LLMs that are being portrayed as artificial intelligence, made the observation that as a developer for the platform our company works the most out of it, it was important to have awareness of any conversations regarding it and to attempt to, quote, guide it in a way that made sense, end quote. Off the record, however, the words torpedo and glorious failure may have been used. In what way can I best, quote, guide it in a way that makes sense, end quote, until it is abandoned without immediately losing my job?
Holy crap. Okay.
It should also be noted that he is being referred to on the Discord now as ThinkTankBee. And from your laugh, I'm going to assume you approve. There was a question about that, so yes.
That's wonderful. Yeah, so I would say, so I mean, there's some weaknesses of AI that are exploitable, right? And so what you can do is you can ask it to perform mathematical functions. So there's some things that AI seems to be relatively good at, producing small chunks of effective code, for example. It seems to be relatively good at. For some reason, math, not one of those things. Right, when often a lot of these large language models, when asked, is was it 9.11 larger than 9.09? They will say no, 9.09 is larger. Very confusing. Don't know why that is. But in mind you, the text, like the way it gets input is that the text gets translated into binary and not and treated as text rather than the numerals being treated as numbers. It's weird, and I think that might be why. But it's not very good at a lot of different types of math, and so you can guide it to perform some functions that are pretty dependent on its ability to, do math or make those determinations about, determining which fractions are larger than others and stuff like that. Produce functions that are kind of reliant on those operations, and then just have someone double check it. And if it's consistently wrong, then you've guided it to do something that people just seem to think it'd be good at, which is, computers are good at math, right? You've guided it in a way that everyone just kind of agrees is like a pretty good general approach to using AI responsibly, as opposed to producing, a news report that could be full of hallucinations. We all know that is, full of risk. Like, you don't want it to write your press release for you. But if you could have it, perform some functions, like create a chunk of code that is dependent on determining, which fraction is larger or whatever, and then double checking it and seeing if it works, and it consistently fails at that task, well, you just have to throw up your hands and say, I guess artificial intelligence really isn't ready. If it can't even do code, the thing that it's supposed to be good at, then I don't know. It seems like it's not really a great fit for what our company needs.
Let's go to BlackRock Sports Group, who asks, for Arif's premier labor exploiter in the NFL content creation space corner.
What?
That's a mouthful. In a recent pod, Arif accused Justice of labor exploitation.
Correct.
How much is Arif paying Luke for his articles on Wide Left? And given that the pod is posted on Wide Left, what compensation is James receiving?
Okay, first of all, James owns, or Dusty, I guess. James owns Norse code, so he just gets that.
In the loosest form of the word, yes.
Yeah. What happens is the Patreon pays for like a bunch of our expenses, stuff like equipment and, host. A lot of it's just hosting, editing software, doing stuff for live shows, stuff like that. And then at the end of the year, if there's anything left over, we just get a bonus. It's just this is kind of how it works. So James just gets the money from Norse code, and the fact that it's posted at Wide Left doesn't really, I don't make any money from it being posted at Wide Left. That's just it's convenient for people who have the app to have to be able to listen to the podcast. So that's not a big deal. As for Luke, I don't actually ask him to write anything. He just He just does it, and
he does it for the exposure.
Right, and were I to ask him, probably it would make sense to pay him, but he just like throws an article at me, and I'm like, okay, are you sure? And he's like, yeah, no, I love this piece. I'm like, okay, well, it's dog shit, but I'll throw it out.
There's an abnormal amount of feet in it, but okay.
Yeah, I'll throw it. I mean, if that's what you want, man. So I'm doing him a favor, really, because this just seems to be what he wants. But no, I'm not paying him.
Charles Wrights asks, for Arif's impending parasocial cavalcade corner, how many elements should our secret handshake have so we can verify each other's identity on Sunday?
3. I don't want it to be too complicated, man. First of all, so many of you are British. I just feel like secret society is great at. Secret handshakes, I'm not as confident.
Yeah, that's fair. Final question is from Skimbleshanks the Railway Cat. Is James stupping my wife?
Great question.
So this is a reference to a conversation we had during the bonus episode where I received an angry phone call and was accused of of a crime I did not commit. And I continually refer to it as stupping. And apparently that's slightly taken off. So no, I am not stupping your wife, nor is Sam Darnold stupping your wife, probably. Though that has been that has become a meme in the Discord. So do what you got to do. But no, I am not. But you really should check out the bonus episode. It is fantastic. I did put a clip of it out on Twitter if you want to check that bit. I was doing Arif a favor because in it he's complaining that he hasn't heard from the Kia lawsuit people. And was trying to get an update. So if you know anything about this lawsuit, please contact Arif. So I was like, oh, hey, this sounds like a perfect thing to put out on social media for him. I'll do Arif a solid. This will be nice.
Okay, I'm at the website now, just because you mentioned that. Yeah, I'm not. The website has changed for sure.
Oh, with all the money they got from the lawsuit,
I'm not seeing new information though. It's just it's dark mode compatible now. That's nice.
What a nice feature of that. Yeah. Well, that is going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. We'll be back next week to hopefully discuss the victory over the Jets. Arif, what do you have to plug?
Buy me a car. No.
Funnel the money through Norse Code first, and then.
Yeah, right. However it can happen. It's Norse Code will treat it as a business expense, right? So, let's not tell Erin about that. I know she listens. Doesn't matter. So at Wide Left, Luke wrote about whether or not the Vikings were real, and it seems certainly like he kind of took that question a little bit more literally than most people are asking it, so that you're going to have to suffer through the first half of that kind of an existential claim piece. Then I've also got my piece on the Minnesota Vikings and their win over the Packers. Woohoo. I'm going to have a piece on the Jets as it relates to my visit in the UK. I found some interesting connections that'll be kind of fun to write about and throw into a piece. And then after that, I'll have a piece on gambling over at Wide Left.
Well, that's going to be it for this episode of Norse Code. Hope you guys have enjoyed it. We'll be back next week. So for Arif, my name is James. And please remember, the signs are all in English in Germany. And we'll be back next week. Norse Code is the largest and only division of Norse Code LLC. You can find Norse Code on the Daily Norseman, SB Nation's Vikings blog at dailynorseman.com. You can also find it on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, and wherever fine podcasts are aggregated. Our Vikings blogger extraordinaire and generally useful human is Arif Hassan of... And he can be found on Twitter at Arif Hassan NFL. I am your producer and host, and my name is James Pagashnik. You can find me at the show's official Twitter feed at NorseCodeDN or at my personal account at Big Mono. If you'd like to donate a few bucks to the show, you can do so in a couple of different ways. You can go to patreon.com/NorseCode and donate there. For $3.50 a month, you get bonus material and more. You can also go to paypal.me/NorseCode for a one-time donation, or you can go to norsecode.threadless.com and pick up some Norse Code merch. Any questions or comments that cannot fit in a tweet can be sent to norsecodepodcast@gmail.com. On behalf of the Norse Code staff, we thank you so much for listening.
Our formula is this.
All things are possible through the power of Ben DiNucci.